Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murdered 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Raimundo Rios Mayo Library in Arkansas. And welcome to the show. This is Chris James, your host. This is Season 1, Episode number 33. Who would have thought we'd lasted that long? Saturday, December 17th, 2016. Tonight we are going to be talking about the Dyatlov Pass mystery. Something out of Russia, something a lot of people have never heard of, and people that have heard, well, they've heard a convoluted story, and hopefully we'll be able to, if not answer any questions, at least let you know what had happened. Tonight's show was suggested by Jeff Morris, a fan of the show, lives over near Texas City. I first read about the incident back about 15 years ago in a magazine article about strange things going on in Russia. But before we get going over to Russia, I wanted to just say a few words about what's coming up in just a few days. During Halloween, there are ghosts and goblins, vampires and werewolves running around demanding treats or else. But hey, they stay outside and they make their demands from the front yard. Just think how different things would be if these monsters were to suddenly appear at the foot of your bed, spying on you to see what you're doing. They don't, but there's someone who is kind of stalking you. You'd better be nice or else. Yes, we're talking about Saint Nick or Santa Claus, or Kris Kringle, or even Popo Jiju, if you saw the movie. He sees you when you're sleeping. Now, if you're one of the nice kids, and that elf gives a good report, you wake up to a pile of toys deposited in the corner of the living room. Maybe a Red Ryder BB gun, if there's such a thing in your future. Or how about an Oscar Mayer wiener whistle? Same movie. But what about that kid next door? You know the one. He put firecrackers under your granny's rocker. The guy that stole all your Halloween candy. What happens to him? Well, part of the story is missing. You better watch out. You better not cry. What happens if you don't behave? Have you ever heard of Krampus? He's the alter ego of Santa Claus, the evil non-twin that takes care of the kids that didn't behave. Krampus is a horned, anthropomorphic folklore figure described as being half goat and half demon, who during the Christmas season punishes children who have been misbehaving. In contrast with St. Nicholas, who rewards the well-behaved with gifts, Krampus is one of the companions of St. Nicholas. In regions including Austria, Bavaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovenia, and parts of northern Italy. The origin of the figure is unclear. Some folklorists and anthropologists have postulated a pre-Christian origin for the figure. Although Krampus is usually described as being covered with hair, which is brown or black, as opposed to Santa Claus, who has white hair, he sports a set of huge ram horns or goat horns, and he has cloven hooves. For all intents and purposes, he's just about the same character as the devil. Krampus is said to be wrapped in chains, not like a restraint, but just kind of draped over his arms and shoulders. He clashes the chains for dramatic effect. The chains are sometimes accompanied with bells of various sizes. He carries a bundle of birch branches called a rutin that he uses to pound on children that have been misbehaving. The birch branches are sometimes replaced with a whip or some other device to punish those naughty children. If the kids have been especially bad, say they set fire to the barn, Krampus brings a sack or a basket which is strapped to his back. This is used to cart off evil children for drowning or eating or maybe transport to hell. Some of the older versions make mention of naughty children being put in the bag and being taken away and never to be seen again. So, as you're eyeballing that elf who's going to drop a dime on you to Santa, just think how much nicer it is to get toys than a sound beating. You see, being naughty isn't all that cool now, is it? And now, it's off to Russia to have a look at one of the most enduring mysteries coming out of Siberia. All of these names are in Russia, and I don't speak a lick of Russian, so I'll do my best to pronounce their names correctly, but don't expect it to sound all that good. It was January 1959. I was only 9 months old and not into mysteries yet. A group of students decided to hike out into the Ural Mountains as a show of their good Communist Party membership. This was a common enough occurrence in those days. If you were a student attending classes, you were expected to go out and tour the countryside, so people living out there could see you were not separate from the workers. Everyone was supposed to be equal, although some were more equal than others. The government encouraged these hikes as a form of training should the need arise for military activity in the cold, snow-covered countryside. World War II had only been over for 13 years, and the Cold War was getting cranked up. It was also a form of exercise and a character-building endeavor. Nothing builds character like a frostbitten backside. Hiking is not a very good description. They would be cross-country skiing on trails that would be under several feet of snow. In order to negotiate these snow-covered mountain trails, they would need somebody with experience. Igor Alekseyevich Dyatlov, born January 13th, 1936, was to be the group's leader. He'd made this hike on numerous occasions, so he already knew the area. He was also an experienced survival guide, so the rest of the party should be in safe company. The youngest member of the group was Ludmila Alexandrovna Dubinyina. Like I said, these names are Russian and they put too many letters in them. Dubinyina was born May 12th, 1938. She was 21 years old. Then the oldest of the group, Semyon Alekseyevich Zolotaryov, born February 2nd, 1921. He would have been 37 at the time. 10 students and staff from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. They were all experienced cross-country athletes and had spent plenty of time camping in less than friendly locations. Before leaving, they had told their friends they would send word by telegraph. There were few phone lines in the area where they were headed. Just as soon as they reached Oraten, the mountain, well known as a hiking and skiing destination, and then returned through Vishai, they figured this would happen no later than February 12th. Now, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after these messages and a pause for station identification. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Looking for a great cup of coffee? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Truck, 1002 Eaterby Day, Suite number 7. Not a coffee drinker? They have hot chocolate, hot tea, and sometimes muffins and cookies. It's a great place to meet your friends for a conversation or curl up in the corner with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanesa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanesa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. And just a reminder, Christmas is coming. There are always a few people you just don't know what to get them. Well, how about a book or two? And check out some of my writings at Amazon.com. Such classics as Flying Saucers Attack Walmart or This Sucks. This Sucks is a story about a vampire. Well, it's a man trying to become a vampire, but he doesn't quite know what it is he's gotten himself into. In the movies, when a man turns into a bat, a 150-pound man turns into a 3-pound bat. And I always wondered, what happens to the rest of the man? Well, in my book, a 150-pound man turns into a 150-pound bat. And he doesn't know how to fly because we don't know how to fly. So what does he do? He goes up onto the castle wall and throws himself off in an attempt to learn to fly. And check it out at Amazon.com. Simply type in Chris James, This Sucks to find a list of all my books. And with that, let's get back to the show. Back then, if you were traveling far, you went by train. The 10 adventurers boarded a train in Yekaterinburg and headed out on what should have been the trip of a lifetime. Once they arrived in Ivdel, it was time to arrange for other transportation. Around this point, Yuri Yudin became too sick to make the trip. He was forced to back out and send his friends on their way as he returned back to the college. He just knew that if he did continue, the cold weather and the hiking would only make him sicker, and this would lead to the group falling behind on their schedule. So he turned around and headed home, leaving the 7 men and 2 women in the group. Yuri felt extreme disappointment and frustration at not going with his friends. He was going to miss out on all the fun. He hoped that the next trip would be soon, and he'd be in good enough shape by then. The 9 remaining hikers found a truck hauling provisions out to the town they would pass through, so they piled into the back and were driven out into the mountains. The town of Visay would be the last inhabited development on their trek. The Dyatlov party spent the night in town and then set out for the wilderness in the morning. The goal of the cross-country journey was to reach Otorten, which is a mountain to the north of Visay. The foreboding peak is better known to the Mansi tribesmen as Kholat Syakal, which translates as the Mountain of the Dead. In February, this route was considered to be a Category 3, which there was no Category 4. 3 was the most difficult. The idea was to do something difficult, so when they got home, they'd have bragging rights. They were young, they were in good shape, and they were well equipped for the weather. On January 31st, the group set up a supply site where they could leave behind supplies that would be needed for the return trip, but were just too heavy to haul around in the woods. If you're going to eat, you had to bring it with you. If you wanted it on the trail, it was in your backpack. On February 2nd, the hikers wanted to reach the pass and clear it so they could camp on the other side. They had moved away from the tree line and were working their way up an open patch when the weather conditions deteriorated. This led to a deviation in their course, perhaps to use a less difficult trail. When it became apparent they wouldn't get over the pass by sunset, they set about erecting their tent and setting up camp in an open field. Having clomb up to this point, no one wanted to turn around and lose the ground they had gained. They had a huge cold-weather tent with a combination heater and stove. This would keep them warm at night, as well as allow them to cook their food and make hot tea. As the sun vanished from the sky, the hikers bundled into the tent, and after a hot meal they settled in to sleep, so they'd be ready to set out for the pass at first light. It was Semyon Zolotarov's 38th birthday. I imagine they had some kind of a celebration in his honor. And something truly bizarre happened that night. February 12th came and went with no telegram. But nobody back home was all that worried. Groups had made this trip before on occasion and had been snowed in or slowed down by the weather or the conditions. It was not until the relatives started complaining that a search party was put together to go out looking for the missing hikers. By February 20th, a collection of students and faculty began following the trail Dyatlov had used for his expedition. When the conditions became too extreme and concern had turned to frustrated worry, the military was contacted and asked to have a look. The Soviet military went out with helicopters and began to fly back and forth over the area where the hikers should have been. The students and faculty continued searching on foot. On February 26th, the searchers found the group's abandoned and badly damaged tent on Kholat Syakal. The campsite baffled the search party. Mikhail Sharavin, the student who found the tent, said the tent was half torn down and it was covered with snow. The tent was set back up so the searchers could see if there was any indication as to where the Dyatlov party had gone. The front of the tent was still closed and sealed against the cold weather. However, the searchers found numerous slits had been made in the side of the tent, as if someone inside needed to look out, and in a very big hurry. Now think about this. The tent is the only thing you have to keep the cold wind off you while you sleep. If you damage the tent, there's hardly any way you can fix it out in the middle of nowhere. You don't go cutting holes in the tent unless there is a very real, very scary reason to do so. All of the cuts had been made from the inside. The back of the tent had been cut wide open to allow the folks inside to escape. But escape from what? And they had run in such a hurry, none of them bothered to take any of their gear. At night, you would take your boots off because your feet needed to air out at night, or you'd develop all kinds of nasty problems. I learned this in the Army. You didn't sleep with your boots on unless somebody was shooting at you. You're lying in your sleeping bag. You know it's cold outside, and the ground in every direction is covered with snow. Something motivates you to rip open the tent and flee into the night, leaving your warm boots, your jackets, your clothing, and your gloves behind. They must have seen something horrifying outside their tent, and whatever it was coming their way. As they ran, the group split up. 5 headed downhill, running through the waist-deep snow in just their socks, or as some were barefoot. The other 2 split off and ran for the tree line to the east of camp. Waist-deep snow in underwear and socks. The investigators began to search the area around the tent in what was now a recovery operation. The gear left behind in the tent said there would be no survivors. No one could survive in the mountains in such cold weather without their coats and boots. The recovery team found footprints running away from the tent, but there were none coming towards it. Whatever had motivated this mass exodus was not on foot. About a mile away at the edge of the forest, at the base of a large old cedar tree, the recovery party found the first 2 bodies near the remains of a fire. This is where Yuri Krivoshenko and Yuri Doroshenko had spent their last moments on Earth. They were both shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. The branches on the tree were broken off up to 15 feet high, suggesting that the skiers had climbed up to look for something. Perhaps they were trying to spot the camp, or did they climb up to look for whatever had been pursuing them? Forensic tests later confirmed that traces of skin were found embedded in the bark, indicating the pair had been frantically climbing the tree and snapping off branches until their hands were torn and blistered. The medical examiner recorded that the corpses had livor mortis on the front, the side facing up. This is a condition where the blood pools to the part of the body closest to the ground. Since the livor mortis was facing up, this would indicate the bodies had been moved or turned over after they had been dead for a while. It takes about 20 minutes for this to appear. As the recovery continued, 3 more bodies were found midpoint between the tree line and the tent. It looked as if they had been making their way back to the tent, either to get their clothes, their warm weather gear, cold weather gear, or to re-inhabit the tent. The positions of the 3 bodies showed that they had been crawling in a line, attempting to get back to the tent. Were they crawling to stay out of the wind, or to keep from being seen by whatever had caused them to run in the first place? Dyatlov was amongst these 3 bodies. He was found laying on his back with a tree branch clutched in one hand. The branch was too small to be used as a walking stick, but it was big enough to be used as a weapon. There was no indication the club had been used on any of the others in the group. Rustin Slobodan had a fractured skull, but it was not the cause of death. The skull trauma he had could not be attributed to clumsiness or disorientation. He didn't trip and fall, and he wasn't struck by his companions. It appeared as if someone had attacked him. Both of these men had bruises and scrapes on their knuckles as if they'd been in a fist fight, but nothing showed signs of having hit each other. Zenaida Kolmogorova, one of the women in the party, had a bruise on her waist that looked as if she'd been hit with a club. She was found the farthest from the tent, and There was blood on the ground near where she was found, but the blood wasn't hers. In addition, it took an additional 2 months before the last 4 hikers could be found. They had been hunkered down in a ravine, farther away from the tent and the tree where the 2 men had been found. This is where the mystery really takes a turn. These 4 had died from traumatic injuries. They had broken bones, but there was no external signs of trauma. Notably, the bodies had no external wounds, as if they were exposed to an extreme level of pressure. 2 of the bodies had severe rib fractures, 1 with a skull fracture as well. Ludmilla was found with her chest crushed by some incredible force. She was missing her tongue, her lips, and both eyes. Missing as in not there. She didn't swallow her tongue. It wasn't bitten through. It was gone. The medical examiner never found what had taken her body parts, or where the parts had ended up. There was no sign of tooth marks as in a small animal. They were simply missing. Semyon Zolotarov was found with his camera still hanging from around his neck. Why did he bother to grab his camera but not grab his boots or coat? The amount of trauma was what you would expect to see in a major car accident. However, the outer signs were not there. It simply looked as if the insides didn't belong on the outsides. Dr. Boris Vozoyorodin, who examined the bodies, said it was what you would expect to find in a bad car accident. The last 4 bodies found were dressed in items that belonged to the other 5 hikers. One of the men was wearing Ludmilla's coat and hat, and she had her feet wrapped in pieces of pants from one of the first dead bodies that they had found. Apparently she had been one of the ones that had stripped the dead for her own survival. When checked with a Geiger counter, the last 4 victims all showed signs of elevated radioactivity. It looked as if the group had realized their situation was dire and did everything they could to preserve themselves. They had gone so far as to dig out a den in the snow, line the floor and the sides with branches in an effort to keep themselves warm. For some unknown reason, the bodies were actually found a few feet from their improvised shelter in a deep part of the ravine on an area that was about 6 feet deep. Also, some of the clothes that had been taken from the bodies left underneath the cedar tree were placed on the cedar branches, but apparently they were not used. If you're freezing to death, and you've gone as far as to strip the clothing from your dead companions, you'd put them on to stay alive. Why hang the clothing from a tree? They had done a lot of work building this structure, instead of traveling back to the tent where they knew warm clothing and food could be acquired. Just to add a bit more to the mystery, all the victims looked as if their skin had been exposed to the sun for some time. Their skin was darkly tanned. We are going to pause here for a few commercials. We will be right back after this, so don't go away. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Looking for a great cup of coffee? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Truck, 1002 Eaterby Day, Suite number 7. Not a coffee drinker? They have hot chocolate, hot tea, and sometimes muffins and cookies. It's a great place to meet your friends for a conversation or curl up in the corner with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Truck. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanelza Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanelza Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. Hope you've been enjoying it so far. Wishing to close the case, the idea of an avalanche was tried. If the hikers were awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of an avalanche descending on their tent, they would have simply run without thinking about taking anything with them. The trouble with this idea is there were no signs of an avalanche in the area. At the site where they had placed their tent, the ground wasn't all that steep. Lastly, why did they take the time to cut peepholes in the tent before taking to their heels? The sound of an avalanche rumbling down onto the tent isn't the kind of thing you'd have to say, "What's that noise?" These were experienced folks, not just city kids. The slope they had pitched their tent on was right at 30 degrees. The absolute bare minimum you need to get an avalanche started. The official Soviet investigator, Lev Ivanovov, was finding more questions than answers. He put together a hastily composed report that all 9 deaths had been caused by what he described as an unknown elemental force which they were unable to overcome. He was unhappy with Moscow wishing to close the case, even though no conclusive explanations had been found yet. For some weird reason, Moscow had the files classified as top secret, so no one could look into the mystery. It wasn't until the 90s that the files became available to the public. Later, Ivanovov told people he knew that he thought they'd been killed by aliens from a UFO. Some came up with the theory that the local tribe, the Mansi, had become angered by something the students had done and murdered them. The authorities looked into this but could find no evidence of murder. In fact, the Mansi had been there with the search party looking for the Dyatlov party and had no reason to injure them or kill them. Hikers had passed through the area on dozens of trips, and the Mansi were friendly as well as helpful. There were no religious or sacred sites anywhere near the pass. Another theory came up, saying escaped criminals had attacked the hikers and killed them. If this were to be believed, why was nothing taken? All the gear had been left at the tent. A group of escaped convicts would have needed supplies if they wanted to reach any of the towns nearby. That and the fact that the nearest gulag was over 60 miles away. Escaped prisoners would have not wanted to head into the mountains, even if they were trying to evade capture. There is a reason they call them the Mountains of Death. As the investigation continued, reports of weird lights seen in the sky over the mountain began to come in. A group of hikers on a separate trail, 30 miles away, had seen odd orange lights hovering over the area on a number of occasions. This new slant brought out the idea that the Dyatlov party had a close encounter with aliens from outer space. The authorities immediately tried to squash these ideas. They were willing to entertain just about anything else but that. Would aliens have abducted the 9 hikers, performed some inhuman experiments on them, and then simply dumped them off to freeze? A lot of alien abduction reports tell of bizarre medical treatment at the hands of these otherworldly kidnappers, but seldom are the reports ended with death. But then, we only have reports from the survivors. Think cattle mutilation and then compare it to the Dyatlov mystery. Back at the tent, authorities found a camera and some diaries that had been kept by the group. The camera had film in it, which needed to be developed and printed. The diaries were perused in an attempt to find out why the hikers had panicked and died in such horrible conditions. The diaries had been logged by whoever in the group wished to make an entry. The handwriting was in all the hikers' hand. It told about how the 9 had traveled from Ekaterinburg, the home of their university, and some of the sights they had seen. Some of the entries referred to photos taken by Semyon, the eldest member of the party, and one of the 2 members of the party with a camera. The last entry stated they had set up camp near the pass and would continue in the morning. The film from Semyon Zolotarov's camera was developed, and it contained all the photographs you'd expect to see in a hiking group. Group photos of the 10 original team members, photos of some of them hamming it up for the photographer, and pictures of the countryside as the party made their way through the region. There was a photo taken showing Yuri Korovinchenko taking a photo of Semyon with the other camera, and a photo from Semyon's camera he had taken of Yuri at the same time. They had been enjoying their last days. There was one photo that got the people interested and brought about even more questions than answers. The photo was taken in the woods on one of the trails. It was probably the second to the last day, since the party had moved into the open mountains after that. The photo is a bit blurry. Back then you had to focus your camera, and there's no such thing as a stabilized camera. The image looks to be that of a man standing amongst the trees. It doesn't look like any of the Dyatlov party because they were all bundled up against the cold, and this image looks as if it's not all that well dressed. What was it about this shape that caused Semyon to take this mysterious photo? Film had to be bought, then loaded into your camera. Once you clicked the shutter, the film had to be taken to a photo lab to be processed, and then printed. Semyon was an amateur photographer, but he was also a student at the university and not all that rich. There had to have been something that caught his eye and enticed him to capture this image. Was someone or something following the party as they made their way through the woods? If so, why? Now, curiosity killed the cat, but folks living out there in the woods would have been too busy working on staying alive to go traipsing out into the woods to spy on a bunch of hikers, especially since hikers came through the area at all times. Perhaps this was the guy from the village that wasn't all there. He followed the hikers with his deranged intentions of killing them just because the voices in his head told him to. These hikers were outdoors type. They climbed mountains in their spare time. Semyon had served in the army from 1941 until 1946. He survived the war which had killed millions. One man, even if he was deranged and had enormous strength, would have been no match for these 9 people combined. And what would a crazy man have to do to scare these folks into running away in the freezing cold darkness? One of the camera that Semyon had with him, he had a photograph that was taken the last day of their hike. It showed the Dyatlov party all busy putting their tent up. They looked like they knew what they were doing, and no one looked in bad shape, physically or mentally. The way to put up a tent in the snow is you dig down as far as you can. You set the tent up, and then you pile the snow up on the sides, so the wind is channeled up and over the top. The snow also helps insulate the tent, and it keeps the inside a lot warmer. And then the last photo on the film in Semyon's camera, found hanging around his neck, appears to capture a giant bright flash against the night sky, as if a missile launch were underway, or someone had been shining a spotlight on the tent. It could have been the result of an accidental overexposure. Back then, film was subject to all kinds of accidents, and if you didn't use the right adjustment on you pointed towards a bright light, you'd get a whiteout instead of a photograph. Was this last photograph the reason Semyon grabbed his camera instead of his gear? And is this what terrified the hikers into heading out and running through the snow? As time went by and no answers were forthcoming, people began to come up with their own answers. One idea was that the hikers had stumbled upon a secret military test of some unknown weapon, and the weapon had killed them, but it had done so in a number of different ways. The longer this idea was examined, the less traction it had. So the weapon didn't kill them, but the soldiers guarding the weapon did. Once again, the question of how comes up. How do you cause internal trauma without damaging the skin? Even the United States was blamed for the deaths. A group of covert espionage paratroopers had dropped into the area, only to find the hikers had set up camp in their drop zone. The mission was so important that the special forces had killed the Dyatlov party in order to keep the mission secret. But what could have been their mission? To spy on the Mansi? To investigate the amount of snowfall in the mountains? There was nothing near the pass that would warrant a military insertion, nothing to even warrant the Boy Scouts going into the area. The so-called experts have tried to close the case by announcing paradoxical undressing as the cause of their deaths. Paradoxical undressing is a weird phenomena where as a person becomes colder and colder, all the blood is shunted to the core in an attempt to stay warm. This causes the victim to suddenly feel warm, so they start taking off items of clothing. This will lead to most recovery teams finding the victim they're looking for partially clothed and frozen to death. The problem with this explanation is the Dyatlov party were safe and snug inside their tent when they all panicked at the same time. They cut a huge hole in the only warm place within miles, and then ran out into the freezing night in just whatever they had gone to bed in. So they would have been warm and dry when they developed this so-called paradoxical undressing episode. Donnie Eicher, a filmmaker and author, spent 4 years investigating the Dyatlov Pass incident and has now claimed that he has discovered a scientific explanation for the baffling case. The Infrasound Theory, to which the author has come up with, is a bizarre but apparently plausible explanation, which argues that sound waves, too low to hear, could have subtly affected the minds of the skiers, panicking them and causing them to rush recklessly out into the snow, where the freezing cold killed them. This sounds like a plausible idea. But then, why is it there have been no other occurrences of people suddenly panicking and running around like this before or after the Dyatlov party? Let's consider the possibility of a wandering Yeti or abominable snowman pouncing on the hapless hikers and squeezing the life out of the victims. First off, why would the bodies be found in groups? As the Yeti is crushing one person, the others could either attack the Yeti, after all they had knives, or run for their lives. The bodies should have been scattered around a lot more. I watched that TV documentary called The Russian Yeti. The locals know it as the mink, and the mink is said to be a nasty creature that will kill if given the opportunity. It was a good show, but I don't think it explains the death of the Dyatlov party. There were no external signs of trauma other than the damage done to Ludmilla. All the other bodies had internal injuries but lacked external signs of trauma. If an 8-foot-tall, hair-covered creature were to go on a rampage, the damage done should have been obvious. That, and it doesn't explain the radiation found on the last 4 bodies. Then someone came up with a tongue-eating Yeti, but why kill everyone and only eat one tongue? On some kind of a weird diet? Yeah, we're going to take a brief pause here to play a couple of commercials. Don't go anywhere, and we will be right back after these. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Looking for a great cup of coffee? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 1002 Eaterby Day, suite number 7. Not a coffee drinker? They have hot chocolate, hot tea, and sometimes muffins and cookies. It's a great place to meet your friends for a conversation or curl up in the corner with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
Say goodbye.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. Have you managed to finish your Christmas shopping yet? If not, might I suggest a few books from Amazon.com? You can get the BAG Company, the Saucers for you science fiction folks, and Shadows for the horror fans. All my books are available at Amazon.com. Simply type in at the top, Flying Saucers Attack Walmart by Chris James. It'll take you to a page where you can find a list of all of my books. So check them out. For those of you that just can't decide what to buy someone, how about a book or two? Now back to the story. There's a centuries-old horror legend in the Ural Mountains. The Mansi tell about the fearsome Zolotaya Baba. She is also known as the Golden Woman, the Golden Hag, or the Golden Lady. Legend tells of her being somewhat archaic, creature who may decide to end your life on a whim. Some of the local tribes worship her as a deity, while others fear her as a demon. When no explanation was found as to who had killed the 9 hikers, some of the locals began to whisper it was Zolotaya Baba that had taken their lives. February 2nd is the date of the pagan rite of Imbolc or Imbolig, sometimes referred to as Candlemas by those involved in occult worship. It comes midway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox, and is often associated with sacrifice, namely human and animal sacrifice to ensure a good spring planting. February 2nd is the night of this Candlemas. Weirder still, Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, and Richie Valens all died the next day in a plane crash. I don't think there's a connection, but it is an odd thing. There are those who think Semyon Zolotarov had something to do with the deaths. Why would such an old guy, all of 37, be hanging around with these kids? Well, seeing as when he was 20 years old, he was drafted into the army to fight the Nazis, he was probably trying to relive his younger years. Who could blame him for trying to regain his lost youth? Others tried to say Dyatlov was a lousy guide and had gotten the party lost, and this led to their deaths. Dyatlov was well known as a very good guide, as well as being an outdoorsman and a survivalist to boot. Then comes the jealous rage theory. 2 girls, 7 men. Russians don't do much without taking some vodka along. The theory is they got drunk and a fight broke out. The scuffed and bruised knuckles of some of the men is supposed to be the evidence. None of the men had any sign of being struck by a fist. The fists had been used on someone or something, but it wasn't on each other. In honor of the lives lost in the area of the pass, the authorities named the pass after Dyatlov. There's a big stone marker set near the area where they all died, with small photographs of each of the party. January 2016. A body was discovered by tourists at the infamous Dyatlov Pass in Russian Ural Mountains. The pass has become somewhat of a tourist destination by both the morbid and those wishing to pay their respects. The unidentified body was found as a group of hikers were revisiting the site where the Dyatlov Pass had met with tragedy. So far, the authorities have not determined who he was or what happened to him. He appears to have been about 50 years old. Yuri Yudin, the only survivor of the original 10 hikers, said, "There is no proof of what really happened. If I had a chance to ask God just one question, it would be, what really happened to my friends that night?" The 9 members of the Dyatlov party were all buried together in a cemetery near where they had attended classes at the Polytech University. When Yudin died in 2013, he was buried in the same plot with his friends. He was finally able to rejoin the Dyatlov party. To this day, no one has come up with an idea of what killed these 9 young hikers. As theories are rolled out and tried on the public, they all quickly fall apart. The mystery of what happened that night, February 1957, is still just as big today as it was back then. What could have motivated 9 experienced wilderness adventurers to abandon all their life-preserving equipment to face certain death in the cold, dark night on the side of a frozen mountain? That's it, as far as the Dyatlov Pass story goes. I'm not going to announce the next show yet because, well, Brian is still sick, but he very much wants to be on the show. So until I know for sure, I'll just say next Saturday at 5, I'll be here, so join me. I have a copy of my book, The Bag Company. I was just going to read a few pages out of the front just to give you an idea of what you're missing. This book is dedicated to Garrett Clark, the son of two friends of mine. It took a lot longer than I would have thought. The Demon. Have you ever heard the sage advice that went, if you don't understand Latin, don't read it out loud? This is very good advice. It is written down in an easy-to-understand English on page 14 of the extremely informative tome called The B-Movie Survival Guide, lovingly put down on paper by Gary Cook, Debbie Rochon, and Peter Schmidge. Available for $9.95 at Amazon.com, or less if maybe a friend of yours has it, or you can find it at the used bookstore. Good advice had it been taken. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of words adrift on the wind, unheeded. Bob Newman had found the old book in a cardboard box under a pile of trash, under a bigger pile of discarded household items in the dump, out beyond the edge of town. The words were pretty much meaningless to him or his cohorts. They all shared a dislike of anything educational or enlightening or historical. You could say they were just a bunch of schoolish twits. Hey, maybe we can sell it at the used bookstore, Drake, one of his buddies, had suggested. Or better, drop it off an overpass onto a car in the middle of the night. The book was quite large, weighing in at about 18 pounds and measuring 24 by 18 inches. Juan was fond of dropping things from bridges. Usually it was turkey giblets. The cover was some kind of leathery-looking stuff, probably goat or cow, and it was worn-looking. Opening the old musty tome, Bob quickly discovered he had no idea what was written in any of the pages. "What does it say?" asked another non-educated bumpkin. "It says, Stultus non pelego hoc," whatever that means. If Bob had paid more attention in Latin class, that had been offered but not taken, he would have known it said, "Idiot, don't read this book." So what should we do? Sell it or drop it on a car? I say let's read some more. It sounds cool. Bob thought big words sounded cool in any language. Flipping over the next page, he was thrilled to see an illustration. Oh, look, it's got pictures. He held the book upside down so his fellow intellectually challenged boobs could take in the ancient-looking drawing. The illustration showed a group of men. They must be men. They all had beards. Or maybe they were just hairy women. Anyway, they were shown standing in a circle around what must be a bonfire. Hey, it looks like they're having a cookout. Not a bad idea. It's kind of cold out here. I'm going to start a fire. This would be far beyond this young cretin's ability if not for the giant can of lighter fluid he had brought along for just such a purpose. There was plenty of wood since this dump. It took him less time to start a raging fire than it would have taken him to fill out a job application. Hey, you know what would be cool? Let's stand around the fire like those guys in the picture. This sounded like an extraordinarily bad idea, but bad ideas were the only kind Milton ever had. They positioned themselves in a circle around the now smoking, burning, smelly pile of wood, taking up positions just like the book's illustration showed them. What they lacked in thought process, they made up for in being able to recreate a picture. Bob went on with the reading, if that was indeed what he was doing. It had as much to do with reading as a parrot being able to reason out what it was saying. Actually, some parrots held a far better reasoning ability than the combined IQ of the 5 of the 6 doofuses in the dump. If these fine, upstanding examples of what not to be had spent the night at the local coffee shop, drinking espresso and contemplating the meaning of life, instead of guzzling beer and contemplating the meaning of words they didn't understand, the world might have taken on a much rosier hue. You know what this reminds me of? One of those horror movies, where some monster turns up and kills everyone. This not-too-bright statement was from Waldo, a new member of the Ignoramus Club. He hung around because these were the only guys that would put up with his nonsense. He was what you might call a nerd. Look, there's another picture, only this one looks kind of scary. Indeed it did. It showed the men standing around the fire had conjured up some unthinkable creature from another dimension. A very nasty one at that. Wow! That looks just like that thing over there. If you'd like to hear more about this book, check it out at Amazon.com. It's called The BAG Company. Well, that's our show for tonight. Hope you've enjoyed it. Tune in next Saturday when we will be having another show, but I don't know what the other show will be about until later. So, until next time, see you.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.